started. So welcome to the pre-application webinar for a new funding opportunity from the Gabriella Miller Kids First Pediatric Research Program. It's called the Expert-Driven Small Projects to Strengthen Gabriella Miller Kids First Discovery. This is a new R03. It is RFA-RM-21-011. Before I dig into this webinar, I just want to remind everyone that we also have a public webinar coming up. And during the public webinars, that's where we really give you a more full sense of the progress that the program has been making. We invite a couple of our key researchers to come and present on their research with Kids First data. We have the Data Resource Center, who is always launching new tools and features to give an update on that. And we highlight just other really exciting things that are going on related to Kids First. This webinar today is about preparing you specifically for this specific funding opportunity, but we definitely encourage you to attend public webinars, which happen twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall as well. And I'll definitely send these slides right after the webinar, but the registration link is here. I'm not going to go into the full background and history of the program today because we tend to do that during our public webinars, but let me just remind you that Kids First is a trans NIH Common Fund program focused on studying and uncovering new insights into the biology of childhood cancers and structural birth defects, and the potential intersection between these conditions. We know from literature, including this paper from Phil Lupo and Sharon Plan's group, that children with structural birth defects have an increased risk of developing childhood cancer, which of course suggests shared genetic pathways underlying the conditions. And the overall vision of Kids First is to alleviate suffering from childhood cancers and structural birth defects by fostering collaborative research and to uncover the etiology of these diseases by supporting data sharing within the broad research community. We've done this so far in what we called phase 1 of the program by supporting whole genome sequencing of cohorts of children with these conditions and their families, and by beginning to develop the Kids First data resource to empower using these data sets. To date, we have selected 40 cohorts that are somewhere in the sequencing pipeline, and 19 of these data sets have already been released through the data resource, and more are coming. Feels like pretty much every day sometimes. The Kids First data resource is a cloud-based platform that's made up of multiple components, and it includes an AWS, Amazon Web Services environment where the data live. It also includes a public-facing portal where researchers and other members of the public can actually find, search, look at, visualize the data sets that are accessible through the entire environment. It also includes a system for managing access to controlled access, individual level genomic data. We use Gen 3 services for that, which is fully integrated with Dbgap. So that's what end users use to apply for controlled access data sets. And it also includes cloud-based workspaces for bringing tools to the data so that researchers can run large-scale analyses on the large-scale data sets that we now have. There are also some additional integrations now and new ones coming, as I mentioned, all the time, to be featured at our public webinars. But I will highlight just a few key parts as we talk about examples of how this funding opportunity can be used. I suspect that most of you have been to the Kids First data resource portal by now, but if you have not, let me just give you an example of how it is used in Kids First. It was specifically designed to meet the needs of the pediatric research community. So it enables you to build synthetic cohorts out of the many data sets across Kids First. For example, you can search for terms related to heart conditions or congenital heart disease. You can search for a diagnosis like neuroblastoma. But because the data resource is already interoperable with not only Kids First data, but also some data from NCI, when you search these terms, you can actually build an even larger cohort out of data sets from both Kids First and NCI. So let's say you found those heart defects data sets from multiple data sets across Kids First. You found children diagnosed with neuroblastoma from Kids First and NCI. Then you would bring that to the file repository to select which images or which files you actually want to analyze. Some people like to work with aligned read files, and some researchers like to work with the variant calls. And then once you have access to those controlled access data sets from Dbgap, you could push those into the cloud-based workspaces where you could run your own workflows and or toggle between using R or Jupyter notebooks to analyze the data sets. If I have time at the end of the webinar, I'll demo this for those who may not have explored the portal much, because I think it's really important for you to understand what functions are already in place, so that whatever you propose could actually improve that. Now we're in phase 2 of the Kids First program. And some of you might remember that in 2018, we solicited your feedback in a variety of ways to get a sense of the gaps and pressure points that researchers were feeling within the program. These were the consensus recommendation themes that emerged, and they were our guiding light in thinking about how to enhance the impact of the program in phase 2. We formulated these into concepts that received approval last September during the Council of Councils meeting. And if you want to watch that presentation from James Coulomb, the recording and the slides are all available here. But briefly, the 3 broad concepts that were approved were to continue generating genomic and other omics data related to these cohorts, to continue developing and improving the Kids First data resource, and to engage more experts in a variety of activities that could improve different components of Kids First data and infrastructure. And that's, of course, where this RFA fits in. So the purpose of expert-driven small projects to strengthen Gabriella and Miller Kids First discovery is to, again, engage a variety of experts in a variety of activities that will enhance the utility of childhood cancers and structural birth defects data sets. And this includes the genomic and phenotypic data sets that are available and associated resources. So again, it gets back to the data resource and the different tools and workflows that could be useful to analysis and research in this area. So these activities should strengthen future analyses with the ultimate goal of course, improving diagnostic capabilities and therapies for children and their families affected by these conditions. Some of the major goals of this funding opportunity to keep in mind some of the guidelines. The point is to build on and improve Kids First, so it makes sense that the projects must use Kids First data, Kids First standards, Kids First infrastructure and resources as much as possible. But as long as you can make a compelling argument that the activity you're proposing somehow improves Kids First, you can work with other data sets and use other NIH or community standards as well. You just have to somehow connect it back to Kids First. Data and resource sharing is a critical component to this FOA, as it is to the entirety of the Kids First program. So you should be pretty used to that by now, but I'll go into that a little bit more. This FOA is specifically designed to foster new collaborations. For example, bringing together someone who might be an expert in a specific disease area with a tool developer to develop something that would address a gap or a set of research questions that's relevant to either a specific Kids First disease or multiple conditions represented in Kids First. Sometimes you will have to coordinate with the original X01 investigator. For example, if you're looking to get additional data or additional information about the cohort. You know, they're the ones who originally recruited those participants and collected the original data sets. And sometimes you'll have to coordinate with the Data Resource Center to integrate any new resources that would build on top of the Kids First data resource. But we encourage you to incorporate a diversity of expertise, you know, complementary expertise, engage researchers from model organism databases or you know, any of our other, we have a wide net of collaborators now. We really encourage you to tap into any and all of them, and I'd be happy to connect you to some of those researchers. But we do have some resources that will give you a sense of who's already involved with Kids First. The DRC has some pages about Kids First X01 researchers, members of the Data Resource Center, and those who are involved in the Kids First sequencing centers. So this is just a snapshot, but let me actually go ahead and show you that web page. The WebEx panel is getting in my way. Okay, so on the DRC website, if you go to this Partners tab, you can see some of the various researchers who are already involved. Let me zoom in a little. And this is where all of our XO1 investigators, their profiles are exposed if they chose to make them exposed. But then if you're in the portal, you can actually look for and you can create your own profile that you can make public. And then if somebody makes their profile public, you can look for them in the portal itself. So nobody yet talking about how they are involved in zebrafish, but that's an example of the kind of search you could do across the different members. So I made this slide to just tell you about that you can go into the portal, you can make a little profile about yourself, and you can turn the switch on to make it public so that other researchers can go into that members page and find you if they're looking for something to collaborate on. Okay, this is again, just I only duplicated a part of the data and resource sharing expectation section just because I wanted to emphasize the expectation that whatever you build should be made available in a way that enables the broader research community to use it, to adopt it, to continue building on it as well. And this also goes for any new survey instruments or common data elements or anything else that might not be technical. You should also share that as well. So this, I kind of merged them together. If you're creating a new survey instrument and you're creating a new tool to do the extraction, you should be prepared to share the questions, the code, and whatever other documentation to make it so that other researchers can adopt and use and build off of that. In the past, we've actually already compiled some example data sharing plans as they relate to sorry, somebody said they're hearing an echo, and I'm sorry, I don't know what to do about it. It should just be me. I'll try to speak more directly into the mic. Anyway, we already compiled some data sharing plans for the existing opportunities that exist in Kids First, so you can always reference those as well. Okay, now okay, there are several ways to improve the discovery of Kids First data sets, and you should feel free to get creative with your ideas. Let me review the examples that we listed in the FOA, and I'll give you some specific background that I think will be useful if you're interested in pursuing that kind of activity. This is certainly not meant to be comprehensive. There's no way I could just go into all the details of everything that you would need to know, but I can always connect you to the right person or more details if you're interested in learning more about any of this. So the first sort of category of the type of R3 you might want to propose here would be collecting, extracting, submitting deeper data sets or new data types associated with Kids First data sets, or harmonizing and processing data to promote cross-disease, cross-species, and I added just cross-data set analysis. One of the examples we highlighted was activities related to extracting electronic health or medical records or data from electronic health records. We wanted to make you aware that the Kids First data resource is starting to incorporate FHIR standards into its infrastructure. FHIR stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. These are standards that are being increasingly used in the healthcare setting. So it would make sense for you to think about it if you're doing electronic healthcare, record extractions. Let me give you some background. The reason the Data Resource Center has decided to use FHIR is because it's a set of standards that serve as a bridge between healthcare data and research applications. It provides a good amount of structure, which helps make data pretty computable, which of course improves data interoperability, but it's also a really flexible infrastructure so that it can actually capture rich data sets, complex data sets, something more extensible than existing common data models. And the reason this is important in Kids First is because from talking to all of you, we've learned that there's just not really one magical common data model that works for Kids First, that works for every single structural birth defects data set, every single childhood cancer data set. So we were really looking for something that could account for existing data models, but also could be more flexible. And if you're interested in doing this kind of work, I can definitely connect you to members of the Data Resource Center who are launching this right now. Another activity that we discuss is incorporating new data types like images. And some of you XO1 investigators, you already have images, but maybe we haven't ingested those yet. Maybe we need to talk about how to de-identify those images. And the Data Resource Center is actually in the process of piloting an integration with a tool called Flywheel. And it's still kind of new, so we're still learning about where it might fit in, but it could help with image data processing, de-identification. It has functionalities to support workflows related to imaging analysis. So if you're doing anything in the imaging domain, I think you should definitely talk to the data resource about how Flywheel might fit in or how it might not fit in, how, maybe you want to use something else to do a de-identification process to get data submitted to the Kids First data resource, but just wanted to make you aware of that. And for phenotypic data, so you've already learned about some of the standards that have been adopted in Kids First through the Innovation Across the Phenotypic Translational Divide webinar series. For example, we know that the DRC maps all Kids First clinical and phenotypic data to standard ontologies, including Mondo for diseases, HPO for phenotypes, and Uberon for anatomy, and CIT as well. And using these standards has improved the searchability and interoperability of Kids First data sets. We hosted 3 of these webinars, and during the first 2, you got to hear about some more in-depth details about the clinical and phenotypic data being collected across Kids First. We unfortunately didn't really have time to ask everyone to give a presentation on the details of their phenotype data, but you did get a sense of a range of conditions from, heart diagnoses to neuropsychological outcomes to childhood leukemias to multiple organ defects. And it really brought to light how much overlap there is across these conditions and how we could be working together to sort of coordinate the way data is collected and or submitted to make it more inherently interoperable. But if you didn't get a chance to watch these, I strongly encourage you to go back and learn about these data sets or reach out to any of the XO1 investigators to learn more about their clinical and phenotypic data, because there could be something that is relevant to your project as well. But what I also had a brainstorming and discussion during all of these webinars. That was open to everyone, and it was really helpful, again, for just highlighting the places that might be able to improve phenotyping efforts. So everything's documented. There's a blog post associated with each one, and the recordings and the slides are available. The third webinar, I also wanted to mention that I believe it was during the second webinar, or during the first webinar, the DRC kind of reviewed some of their standard processes and procedures for handling phenotype data. So if you want to be reminded about that, you can go there, you can talk to the DRC. And then during the part 2, the DRC also shared the results of a survey that they had as many XO1s as possible fill out. So it kind of gives you a high level view of how XO1s are feeling and handling phenotypic data might be useful to think about. Okay, so part 3 was about cross-species use cases. Several researchers, Kids First and other researchers, presented on how they intersect human data with model organism data in their childhood cancers and structural birth defects research. We also heard from a few of the many model organism databases and some tool developers on how their resources could be used in these research areas. We had a really nice brainstorming activity where we really think there's a lot of opportunities for these model organism folks and the tool developers and Kids First researchers to come together to think about ways to strengthen those data sets to make it easier to co-analyze human data with model organism data. So I strongly encourage folks to watch that recording and look at the slides and notes from a blog from that webinar as well. Okay. Another set of activities that you could pursue with this RFA would be to deploy new workflows or integrate a new tool into the data resource. If you are not familiar with Seven Bridges Kavatica, but you're thinking about building or optimizing a workflow or porting something over into the cloud, I encourage you to review the Seven Bridges documentation. They have tools that can help you create or port a workflow using the common workflow language, which is a GA4GH standard. And there are also resources for Dockerizing that tool or workflow so that it could be shared across multiple environments. This would certainly be an exciting activity. If there's something you want to run in Kavatica, but it's not there yet, you can use this R03 to get it there. And the strength of this approach is that it really enables researchers to run a variety of workflows over the data in the secure private workspaces that Seven Bridges provides. Okay, so you might also be interested in proposing a project that integrates an existing tool into this ecosystem, but oops, sorry, I went too far. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work to take something that, lives in a different system, or maybe again isn't yet optimized for the cloud, and plug it into make it work with all of the components of the Kids First infrastructure. Or you could build a new tool that could be federated with this environment. So in either case, I just want to make you aware of some of the examples or standards that are being used to do similar work. So some of this is being done in an effort called NIH Cloud Platforms Interoperability. Kids First, among other platforms, including Biodata Catalyst, the Cancer Research Data Commons, and Anvil, are already working together to make their own platforms more interoperable, to make it so that tools used in one ecosystem could be applied to Kids First data, vice versa, to co-analyze data in the different environments. One really important standard that is important for this type of interoperability, which would be important for any system that plans to handle controlled access data, is the NIH Researcher Auth Service. So Kids First is launching this within its infrastructure. It basically helps a researcher sign in only once. It's a common sign-on system, but it's also a service that allows a system to authenticate who the user is and to authorize a user to access a specific data set based on that Dbgap approval. So any system that is using controlled access data should really think about and learn a little bit about RAS. Okay, this is not my slide, so I didn't know how many graphics it had. This is a slide from the NCPI developers. I just want to highlight that they are using some other pretty key standards to enable interoperability across the different systems. And let me just go ahead and show you the bulleted version of this slide. So all of the standards that are being adopted across NCPI platforms are pretty well documented. You can learn more about the entire effort and the standards on the NCPI website. For Kids First, again, this really is incorporates the FHIR standard. So not only is FHIR useful for exchange of healthcare data, but it's actually a really useful part of these tools in exchanging any clinical, phenotypic, or metadata. And we're actually in the process of migrating all Kids First clinical, phenotypic, and metadata into FHIR. This is something that doesn't usually matter to you as an end user because this will all be on the back end. You won't even know how FHIR is going to improve interoperability of the data. Okay, sounds like you fixed the echo. Okay. And anyway, my point is just be aware of FHIR as not only something for structuring terms, but also as a critical part of some of some of the tools that might help with clinical and phenotypic data analyses, things like that. I already told you a little bit about RAS. And then another standard that has been really important within NCPI is the GA4GH Data Repository Service. I am not an expert in this, but briefly, what I understand is that we've launched DERS, as it's called, as a way to enable any tool to reference the data that is living in the Kids First AWS environment. So by exposing this DERS API, you could build a tool that could reference the data objects that we're hosting within Kids First. So it's something you might want to explore if you're thinking about tool development. Okay, and another example we talk about in the FOA is consenting for broader data sharing. And this does not apply to everyone, but we did want to mention it in the FOA because some of the especially older data sets, when we first launched Kids First, we didn't realize that they were consented for specific data use, or that they had other restrictions on them that just made cross data set analysis really difficult, which was hard for us because combining and cross analyzing data is the primary goal of Kids First. So if you are thinking about proposing a project that would require going back to your participants to collect richer data sets, or images or something like that, new surveys, anyway, and you have some of the data use limitations that we've kind of identified as, being prohibitive to this combining and cross-analyzing and broader data sharing, you might consider, a broader consent. And this is just to remind you that, in Kids First, we don't look at your consents, but we do get an institutional certification that tells us what your consents say. The goal is always to go for that GRU if you can, with none of the other checkboxes that sort of add these other restrictions. And here I am just sharing some language from the NIH Genomic Data Sharing Policy, where clearly indicates that we expect the broadest possible sharing. I'm sharing a resource, the NIH GRI Informed Consent resource, that actually has some example language that can sort of get you to that general research use. I think in general, GRU is a little bit more about what you don't say. Don't add all these qualifiers about exactly how, telling the participant that the research, that the data won't be used for only one research project, but rather that it could be used for other researchers to understand other conditions. I think, it's always been tricky because there's a history of wanting to focus on one disease, but we're trying to go broader here. And then the data use limitation definitions, as described in some of the additional genomic data sharing materials, in case that's helpful for you. Okay, I know that you're going to ask me about all the other RO3s and where they all fit into each other. So, copied right from the FOA, we tried to make it really clear that, this FOA is about strengthening Kids First X01 data sets and enhancing the functionality of the Kids First data resource to improve future analyses by not just you, but also the broader research community. But we actually do not expect you to address analysis directly, because we have other FOAs for that. We have the Kids First RO3 PAR, which is for analyses, and there's also a common fund data set, RO3 RFA, for analysis. Let me just do a cross comparison of the two Kids First RO3s so that you understand why they're different. So the existing RO3 PAR, it's been around for several years. This is about small research grants for analyzing Gabriella Miller Kids First pediatric research data. Again, the intent is to support analyses of Kids First X01 data sets. It is an RO3. The funding actually does not come from the Kids First quote unquote pot of money, but it comes from the individual IC that would fund it. And these are the institutes that are signed on. It's a PAR, so these institutes have not set aside funds for this purpose. The deadline is 3 times per year according to the standard receipt dates. The budget is for 2 years maximum, should not exceed $200,000 direct costs. So that's $100,000 per year direct costs. And the number of awards just depends on the ICs. For this one, the intent is to support any activity that will enhance the utility of Kids First data. It's also an RO3, but it does use Kids First funds, and we have set aside funds for this purpose, which is why it's an RFA. But there's only one deadline this year, and that's on June 18th. The budget cap is the same, so these are, slightly bigger RO3s, really trying to help you get this work done. And we are intending to set aside enough funding for 9 to 14 awards. I've shared this slide before. This is beyond the Kids First and Common RO3 for analysis. There are other analysis FOAs that could be used to support Kids First analysis. So just sharing this again. We also have FOAs out there that could be used for functional validation, which is an important part of a lot of these research projects. And again, that's kind of that bridge to the model organism work. And we also have a pretty strong collaboration with the Comp2 program. They've been modeling some variants for specific Kids First projects, and I'm pretty sure they're still open to collaboration. So wanted to put that out there. Okay, let me get through these FAQs and then I'll address some of the questions that I'm seeing. So the first FAQ is, I applied for the fiscal year 21 X01 sequencing opportunity, but I'm interested in applying for the expert-driven RO3 RFA to basically work on the same data set, work with colleagues, other experts to improve this data set. When will the X01 decisions be announced, and should I apply for the RFA, this RO3? And our general answer is, whatever you're proposing for the RO3 RFA, can you make a compelling argument that it's going to improve Kids First regardless of what happens with your X01 application? And if the answer is yes, then you should definitely apply. But in terms of timing, I pulled up the X01 timeline and I threw in the RO3 deadline. The peer review for the X01 is taking place in early May. So you might have a score and you might have your summary statements within the month by the time this deadline comes around. However, we usually need to have a lot of internal discussion to finalize our X01 selections. And we don't usually do this until July or August. So by the time you submit your June 18th RO3 RFA, you will not know the answer to whether or not your X01 project will be funded. So keep that in mind. But again, you should apply anyway if it's going to be something really useful to Kids First in general. Okay. Now, FAQ number 2, I'm planning to propose building an optimized workflow deployed in Kavatica. Are cloud credits available to do this? So this question is interesting. We do offer cloud credits currently only to X01 investigators, and the intent is to get X01 started on the analysis that they had proposed in their X01 FOA. However, if the activity that you're proposing relies on separate cloud credits and the RO3 RFA, we can't really guarantee that you would be awarded for both. So you could go ahead and apply for the RO3 RFA. I would recommend that you incorporate into that budget the costs it will take to run the compute that you want to do to build that tool. You could apply for credits, again, if you are an X01 investigator, and then we'll just have to talk about how that would fit into your budget. But the X01 cloud credits goes through a separate administrative review. So I'm just saying I can't guarantee that all the stars would align. So plan to incorporate that into your budget. There are resources for estimating cloud costs, use of Kavatica on the DRC FAQs. So I'll share this to make sure you can look at that. But let me make the point that if you are optimizing a workflow, obviously the costs are going to change. They're going to be probably pretty bad at first. And then as you optimize the workflow, the costs will get better. This is a great type of proposal that we would love to see happen with this RFA. So I definitely want to just vocalize my support for that. What standards have been adopted by Kids First? What other standards might be relevant? Thank you to my colleagues from NIDCR and the National Library of Medicine for helping me come up with an FAQ that goes over some of the standards that are out there. I've already told you quite a bit about some of the standards that are being used within Kids First. Um, and uh, you know, sometimes you just have to use a standard that exists, or you should if it makes sense for your project. But anyway, this is not meant to be comprehensive, but it is meant to be a resource for if you're going to do something with phenotype data, if you're going to do something with fire, if you're going to do something with genomic harmonization, you should be aware of what's already out there, other standards that we've adopted from GA4GH, and other standards that have just come up in other conversations related to intersecting model organism data or you know, imaging data with Kids First. We tried to make the longest list we could to help you out. Okay. Now, let me get to the questions in the Q&A. Okay, so okay, you resolved the echo issue. How can I find out about what projects have already been done to avoid overlap? So we usually, we usually go over the funded projects in our, let me stop sharing for a second because I do have a slide for this. In our public webinars, we usually share that kind of information. You know, we tell you a bit about what RO3s have been funded on a very, very high level, but it should be helpful. And I'm just going to try to find the one we shared recently. I have not yet updated whatever RO3s have been funded. Hang on. But let's see, I'm trying to think if we actually have a place where we publicly share that kind of information in perpetuity. Maybe we don't, but maybe we could. So this is a slide that we tend to share at the, I guess this is very high level. It doesn't even tell you what they're doing, but it does tell you what funding opportunities have funded projects related to Kids First. So they not only come from that RO3 PAR that we have organized, but they also come from NIDCR and Include and some other efforts. So, you know, that probably doesn't help you very much. We also have, but we can, oh, go ahead.
Just to break in, you know, if you want a quicker answer than we would be able to get up on the website, you could go to NIH Reporter and search, and that will show you any project that was from any of these PARs or possibly Kids First or Gabriella Miller as a keyword would bring you any funded projects that were relevant.
Oh, look at that. That's a great answer, and somebody started to give it. Yep, exactly. So reporters the place to go. We have created a web page about journal publications. This is out of date. You Kids First people have been busy publishing, but we are doing our best to track the publication. So that would be a place to go to see, you know, what work is already published. With cross species, can you clarify if the intent is validation and integration across species only, or would it include the development of accessible model organisms? For example, is the goal for projects such as Tumor X similar in cats and humans, or would developing PDX libraries of Kids First cases that were publicly accessible be within scope? Wow. I think to answer your question, you should just, okay, let me try and then James is going to have to help me. There are other FOAs out there for actually developing model organisms. So those might be more appropriate than this opportunity if you want to generate a new mouse or something like that. I guess the examples in terms of model organisms that we were thinking about was a little bit more about cross-analyzing model or cross-annotating knowledge from Kids First data with annotations and knowledge from cross-species data sets. But it's a good point. We probably would accept developing, a resource that would be very useful across Kids First cases. Let James try to help answer that.
Yeah, I mean, not exactly sure. I think the specifics here are going to be very important, and we may also be the various institutes that are involved might be really interested in the model you're thinking about. So probably you should talk to one of the people on the working group whose work is most relevant to that. Daniel Day, for example, for NCI models. If it has to do with any kind of developmental gene, should talk to me about it, and we can sort of suss out the most appropriate way to get the project funded.
Yeah, and you can always connect to me. Oh, sorry, somebody's going to talk, but and I can send you to the right program officer. We can sort of explore together whether it would be a good fit. Wei Ching or someone else, did you want to answer? Sorry. We have the question we get every time we have a webinar, which is how do I apply for data in Dbgap? We have FAQs about this, and there are dozens and dozens of materials about applying for studies in Dbgap. We've also listed the Dbgap study pages for each Kids First project in multiple places, including when you're in the portal, you can find the Dbgap accession numbers. But for example, this is organized by project selection, so you don't see these studies aren't released yet because they were recently selected, but when you start to scroll down, you see Dbgap accession numbers for each study, and there's literally a request button. We have recordings from previous webinars that walk through this process. We'd be happy to share that with you. It can take some time to compile the data access request, but our Kids First Data Access Committee is fast, and the data access request itself will be approved within a day. Oh, okay, Dr. T. Okay, we answered your slide. Can we apply for 2 R03s? You could. You might want to talk to us about strategizing that. Especially when it comes to XO1s, sometimes I advise combining proposals so that you are proposing a larger cohort and you're making an argument for, the value of a cohort as a whole. For this is different because there's actually a budget involved. So, if you have a strong justification for asking for, 200K for 2 individual projects, you'll just have to make sure that each are really compelling. I would encourage reaching out to us. Oh yeah, and like Wei Ching is saying, overlap will be really important. You cannot be asking for the same thing twice. Yeah, so the thing about Kids First is that most of our projects are actually XO1s. The XO1s themselves are not in Reporter because they don't have their actual awards, and that's why we are constantly sharing this link, our XO1 page for what the projects actually are. Many cohorts have D-specific. Is there any possibility for cross-disease analysis? So this is a fun question. If a cohort is consented for the study of one specific disease and another cohort is consented for the study of a different specific disease, those data sets cannot be co-analyzed directly. But there are some nuances to this that I honestly do not fully understand, and you would have to talk to the Kids First Data Access Committee, and we encourage this if you're concerned about whether a certain analysis would be allowable according to consents. It's definitely worth just asking them and providing some details onto what you really mean by combining those data sets. You have to treat them separately, unfortunately, if they have 2 different disease-specific data use limitations. Does Kids First have a standard way to capture environmental data? I don't think we have a magic standard for that. But I do think somebody from our working group suggested a standard. I thought somebody did. Let me ask around about that specifically. I think environmental data is really interesting, and you would think that somebody has done some work on that, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. But let me follow up about that, and we'll get it updated on our website if if we come up with something. Does anybody else from NIH side know of environmental data standards? Okay, we'll look into it. Sorry. Yes, this is being recorded and it will be made available online. Do we need to convince the reviewers on the importance of converting existing pipelines to the cloud, or is it implied in the RFA? I sure hope it's implied in the FOA. We really did try to make that a very clear example. That's what we want to happen, because we know that's been a pressure point for many of you. You have a tool, it's your favorite tool ever. You can run it on your local cluster at Harvard or wherever you are, but we haven't moved it to the cloud yet. And how great would it be if we could move it to the cloud? You know, I would really think about the point being, you know, democratizing access to that tool. You know, the point of this RFA is that you're doing it not just for your own research, but to share that tool with everyone. I really hope the reviewers are convinced by that. It's something we will emphasize with the SRO. So hopefully that, oh, go ahead, James.
Just to pitch in there, you know, you don't have to sell program staff on the importance of that, but you may, it's always good to sell the reviewers on it, even if they're just drinking, I've already drank the Kool-Aid and you're preaching to the choir. It always helps your score to sell them on the importance of what you're proposing.
I'm pretty sure we also asked the reviewers to comment on the resource sharing. Let me see. Review criteria, resource sharing plans. Yep. So we specifically asked, you know, so this is non-scoring section of the review, but this replicates and calls back to what we told you in the research strategy section about resource sharing. So you should address it, and then the reviewers will be asked to comment on it. Is one tool enough? Is the expectation to have 3 aims? Interesting.
Actually, the RO3s almost never have 3 distinct specific aims. Sometimes they do, but the usual model is more like 2 aims, but you know, however you want to break that up. But there is no set requirement.
Thank you, James. Yeah, that's definitely a James question. You know, and I would say, yes, one tool could be enough, especially if it's going to take you work to get it optimized for the cloud and to get it shared. But, you know, if you think you can do 2 tools at a time with, you know, the same workload or whatever, same FTE contribution, then go for it. But I would say 1 tool would be enough. I should call out in this moment that we did add some custom research strategy criteria, but it's really everything I've already described. You know, how will this address gaps? How will it make Kids First better? You know, who is your research team and how is that getting to you to where you're going? To describe the details of what standards you are thinking about adopting and what data sets you might be using. Are we supposed to use the Kids First data analysis platform for the data analysis RO3, or can we use other cloud platforms such as NHLBI Biodata Catalyst? So for the RO3 PAR, that you can do anything. You can do local analysis, you can do analysis somewhere else. The rules for that RO3 is that it just has to involve Kids First data. And that's kind of a difference between that RO3 and this one. This one's really about, you know, making our whole ecosystem stronger. And that other RO3 is really just about you getting a specific analysis done. So yes, you could do something in Biodata Catalyst. That's fine. I mean, we are already interoperating with them. Today you should already be able to use their 7 Bridges platform because it's very plugged into Kavatica, which is our 7 Bridges platform. It might just take a little bit more right now to use their Terra instance or their picture instance or something like that. Now, I think questions have quieted down and we have a few more minutes. So let me demo the portal. And I should admit that I didn't get to practice, but maybe that's okay, last night. So, again, I just really think it's important for everyone to understand the portal before you go into these projects so that you already know what's at play. I've already registered my account, which is just, I actually use my Google, and I've agreed to the terms of accessing the portal, which is a click-through agreement. And then I clicked on the Explore Data tab, which gives me immediately, you have these tabs up top, but visualizations of the entirety of all data accessible through the Kids First data resource. And you immediately notice that here are all the Kids First data sets, but that we're also interoperating with other data sets. This is a new fun little widget related to HPO. So a little wheel showing you the different HPO phenotypes that are represented in this entire data set. It's actually showing you the most common diagnoses across the data set that the data set we're looking at, which is again, all Kids First plus interoperable data, a breakdown of visualizations for demographics, age at diagnosis, and overall survival. Let's see, the use case I was talking about earlier was maybe you're interested in comparing the genomic variants underlying neuroblastoma and congenital heart disease. So let me just go ahead and search for the term neuroblastoma. And you see the studies, but let's ignore studies for a second because I want to capture, a diagnosis that encompasses the entirety of the data we're looking at, not just a specific study. So this is where I'm actually going to use the NCIT term, which is kind of interesting that there's a few more Mondo, but let's use NCIT for the sake of this exercise. This is the NCIT diagnosis. And when I picked that, all of the widgets filtered down to show me all of the same visualizations. And you can see that there are children or potentially family members with neuroblastoma across not only the Kids First data set, but NCI's target data set. And look, there's some children with neuroblastoma from another Kids First data set. And I'm also interested in comparing this to congenital heart disease. So let me actually start a new query. And for congenital heart disease, I want to encompass the most broad phenotype that encompasses as many congenital heart anomalies as possible. So this is where I'm actually going to go and use the HPO tool. And this brings up a nice HPO browser. I'm going to just plug in the word heart and see what it shows me. And again, I'm looking to capture a pretty broad umbrella. You could go down into some of these child terms, but let me capture the abnormal heart morphology to encapsulate all of those terms and apply this filter to the visualizations. So again, we see that there is a data set, for congenital heart defects. This is the PCGC project, but then there's also children with the same condition in other data sets. And you can see those representations again. Now I'm going to build a cohort made up of both of them. I'm going to select both. And here I'm going to use the OR function because I'm selecting children who have neuroblastoma or abnormal heart morphology. And so now I have this bigger cohort of all of the relevant participants. And there's this thing called the file repository, and I always have to remember if you click on this one, you'll lose the synthetic cohort that you built, and you'll lose your filter. But if you click on this one, it'll bring you over to the file repository with your cohort of 13,000 participants or so. And now that I'm in the file repository, I can see the different files that are available for the synthetic cohort that I built. I'm somebody who's interested in only the whole genome data, and I prefer to work with variant calls. I don't want to work with GVCFs. I don't want to work with BAMs. So now we have, about over 1,000 files of variant calls from children with neuroblastoma and also children with congenital heart disease. And if I had access in Cavatica, which I actually don't, I don't have Dbgap approval. But if I did, this is when I would push it over to Cavatica and begin an analysis there. So just wanted to give you a flavor for the portal and how I use it and how you could use it and how those HPO terms, those standard terms and NCIT terms actually help with some of the analysis. We get another question. So let's see. The kids first data appears a little limited in terms of sample size for certain cohorts that couldn't be combined with other cohorts because of the different phenotypes. If using one novel tool, could we propose to analyze one cohort in AIM-1 and another cohort in AIM-2? Sure, but let me clarify that you can co-analyze, data in this setting if they have different phenotypes. It's just when it comes to the controlled access sequence data that if there is a disease-specific data use limitation, it's going to be difficult to analyze data. So let me show you an example. So, Wendy Chung's congenital diaphragmatic hernia project, it's obviously, focused on congenital diaphragmatic hernia, but this data can be used to study other conditions because it's consented for general research use. And I actually think you should be able to, general research use. So you don't have to only study one condition. You can use the data for other purposes. Okay, we are almost out of time. So one of your questions has already been answered in this slide. I will bring it up. For the specific demo for combining two different cohorts, do they share some of the same phenotypes? Otherwise, it doesn't make a lot of sense in combining. It depends on your scientific question. If you are looking for overlapping phenotypes, then you can find them with that search. If you're looking to compare the genetics of two totally different phenotypes, then you can do that too. Okay, and then I hopefully I answered your question about the aims, but if you have more questions about how to organize aims, you should definitely contact us. Okay, great. Okay, good. I'm glad we made that you could do that kind of comparison. That's the point of Kids First. So look for what's similar and or what's different between these childhood conditions. Okay, we're at time. Thank you everyone so much.